Sarah Mitchell thought that she had the perfect marriage until $50,000 vanished from their joint account overnight. Her husband claimed it was for their art gallery. But when Sarah started digging deeper, she discovered something far more terrifying than financial betrayal. The mysterious artist who had captured her husband's attention was orchestrating an elaborate con spanning 4 states. But the most devastating revelation was yet to come. Someone she trusted completely had been lying from the very beginning. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button and let me know in the comments what you would have done in Sarah's situation. Subscribe and ring that notification bell, because stories like this, where ordinary people face extraordinary deception, are exactly what we explore here. Sarah Mitchell stared at her laptop screen, her coffee growing cold as the numbers refused to make sense. $50,000. Gone. Just like that, from their joint savings account, with nothing more than a cryptic notation reading, Gallery Operations BH. She rubbed her swollen belly, feeling the baby kick restlessly inside her 6-month pregnant frame. The morning sickness had finally passed, but now a different kind of nausea was setting in. Brett Harrison, her husband of 3 years, had some explaining to do. The front door slammed shut, echoing through their suburban Denver home. Brett's voice carried from the entryway, sharp and stressed as he barked orders into his phone. No, the authentication needs to be complete before the auction. Victoria, we cannot afford any delays on this piece. Victoria. Sarah's jaw tightened. That name had been coming up frequently in Brett's conversations lately. Victoria Cross, the conceptual artist who had swept into Denver's art scene like a hurricane, promising revolutionary work that would put Brett's family gallery on the international map. Brett appeared in the kitchen doorway, still clutching his phone. His sandy hair was disheveled, his usually pristine appearance slightly frayed around the edges. At 32, he still carried the confident bearing of someone who had inherited both money and social standing. But lately, something seemed different, more manic, more desperate. "Hey, babe," he said, barely glancing at Sarah as he grabbed a bottle of water from the refrigerator. "How are you feeling today?" "Better question is how our savings account is feeling," Sarah replied, turning the laptop screen toward him. "Want to explain this $50,000 withdrawal?" Brett's hand froze halfway to his mouth. For just a moment, his carefully constructed composure slipped, revealing something that looked almost like panic. Then the mask snapped back into place. "Gallery expansion," he said smoothly, taking a long drink of water. "I told you we were making some major investments this quarter." $50,000 without discussing it with me first. Sarah stood up, her curator training kicking in. She had spent years learning to spot forgeries, to notice when details didn't align. Right now, her husband's story had more holes than a counterfeit Monet. "Brett, that's our baby fund. That's the money we save for the nursery, for when I take maternity leave." His expression hardened. "Sarah, you need to trust me on this. The gallery is on the verge of something huge. Victoria's exhibition alone could triple our annual revenue." "Victoria again?" Sarah shook her head. "I've never even met this woman, but apparently she's important enough to drain our savings account." "She's a visionary," Brett snapped, his tone sharper than she had heard in months. "Something you would understand if you were still actively involved in the art world instead of hiding behind museum walls." The words stung. Sarah had built a respected career as a curator at the Denver Art Museum before her pregnancy complications had forced her to reduce her workload. She had supported Brett's dream of transforming his inherited family gallery into something prestigious, had used her connections and expertise to help him build credibility in the art community. "I'm not hiding," she said quietly. "I'm growing our child." Brett's phone buzzed again. He glanced at it, and his entire demeanor shifted, softening slightly. "Look, I'm sorry. You know I'm stressed about the upcoming auction. This Victoria exhibition could change everything for us. Sarah, for our family. You have to trust me." He kissed her forehead quickly, already moving toward the door. "I'll be home late tonight. Victoria needs help with the final installation." As the door closed behind him, Sarah sank back into her chair. The baby kicked again, more insistently this time, as if responding to her elevated stress levels. $50,000. Their entire emergency fund, gone with no real explanation. And apparently their financial future now rested in the hands of a woman Sarah had never met. working on projects she had never seen, in a gallery that was supposed to be their shared dream. Sarah opened a new browser window and typed Victoria Cross Artist into the search bar. If Brett wouldn't give her answers, she would find them herself. 3 hours of internet searching had yielded surprisingly little information about Victoria Cross. For a supposedly revolutionary artist on the verge of transforming Denver's art scene, her digital footprint was remarkably sparse. Sarah found a few glossy magazine mentions, some gallery listings in New York and Los Angeles, but nothing substantial. No major museum collections, no detailed biographical information, no comprehensive exhibition history. For someone in the art world, Victoria Cross was curiously invisible. What troubled Sarah more was what she did find. Several forum posts on art collector websites mentioned Victoria's name in connection with pieces that later turned out to have questionable provenance. Nothing definitively linking her to fraud, but enough to make Sarah's professional instincts twitch. Her phone rang, interrupting her research. Jake Thompson's name flashed on the screen, and Sarah felt her first smile of the day. "Please tell me you're calling with normal human problems," she answered. "Like parking tickets or bad coffee." Jake's familiar laugh carried through the speaker. "Actually, well, I'm calling because my normal human problems include worrying about friends who never answer their texts anymore. You've been radio silent for 2 weeks. Sarah, sorry." Sarah rubbed her temples, feeling the weight of the morning's discoveries. "Things have been complicated." "Complicated? How is everything okay with the pregnancy?" Jake Thompson had been her closest friend since their college days at University of Colorado. While Sarah had pursued art history, Jake had gone the law school route, eventually specializing in corporate litigation. He had been one of the few people who had questioned her whirlwind courtship and marriage to Brett, though he had kept his concerns to himself after the wedding. "The baby's fine," Sarah said. "It's everything else that's falling apart." She found herself telling Jake about the missing $50,000, about Brett's increasingly erratic behavior, about Victoria Cross and her mysterious lack of verifiable history. 50 grand without discussion. Jake's tone shifted into lawyer mode. "Sarah, that's a massive red flag, especially with a baby on the way." "I know, but Brett says it's for the gallery, that this exhibition could change everything for us financially." "And you believe him?" The question hung in the air. Did she believe him a month ago? The answer would have been an automatic yes. Brett had always been ambitious, sometimes impulsive, but never deliberately deceptive. At least, not that she had known. "I used to," Sarah admitted. "But lately, he's been different. Secretive. His phone is always buzzing with his calls and texts that he takes in private. He comes home late, leaves early, and this Victoria person seems to be at the center of everything." "What do you know about her?" "That's the problem. Almost nothing. For someone who's supposedly about to revolutionize contemporary art, she has virtually no documented history. It's like she appeared out of nowhere 6 months ago." Jake was quiet for a moment. "Sarah, I deal with corporate fraud cases. What you're describing sounds familiar, and not in a good way." "You think Brett's being conned?" "I think someone with no verifiable history who suddenly appears and convinces your husband to invest huge amounts of money is worth investigating, especially when that money comes from your joint accounts without your knowledge." Sarah felt the baby shift restlessly, responding to her increased heart rate. "What would you do?" "I'd want to see paperwork, contracts, exhibition agreements, payment records. If this is a legitimate business opportunity, there should be a paper trail." After they hung up, Sarah sat in her home office, staring at the locked filing cabinet where Brett kept all the gallery's financial records. He had always handled the business side of things, claiming it was too stressful for her to worry about, especially now during her pregnancy. But $50,000 wasn't worry. It was their future, their child's future. The baby kicked again, harder this time. Sarah placed both hands on her belly, feeling the life growing inside her. Whatever was happening with Brett and Victoria Cross, whatever scheme was unfolding around their gallery, she couldn't afford to ignore it anymore. She had built a career on spotting fakes, on seeing through careful deceptions to find the truth underneath. It was time to turn those skills toward her own life. "Don't worry, little one," she whispered to her unborn child. "Mommy's going to figure this out." But as she reached for the filing cabinet, She discovered it was locked with a combination she had never been given. For the first time in their marriage, Brett had locked her out completely. Sarah's pregnancy had taught her that some mornings required strategic thinking before getting out of bed. Today was definitely one of those mornings. The filing cabinet lock had kept her awake most of the night, and now she had a plan that would either ease her fears or confirm her worst suspicions. She called the Denver Art Museum, using her curator credentials to access their authentication database. If Victoria Cross was selling pieces significant enough to justify $50,000 investments, there should be some record of provenance verification. "Hi, Marcus, it's Sarah Mitchell," she said to the head of authentication services. "I need a favor. Can you run a search for any pieces that have come through your department with Victoria Cross listed as the seller or authenticator?" Marcus Hoffman had worked in art authentication for 15 years and had helped Sarah investigate questionable pieces during her time at the museum. His response was immediate and troubling. "Victoria Cross Sarah, where did you hear that name?" "She's working with my husband's gallery." "Why do you know her?" "Know her, we flagged her 6 months ago. She's been shopping around what claimed to be a lost Rothko sketch, but the paper analysis came back all wrong. Modern materials trying to pass for 1950s vintage. When we confronted her about it, she disappeared." Sarah's heart began racing. "What exactly are you saying?" "I'm saying Victoria Cross has attempted to sell at least one piece with falsified provenance documents through 3 different Colorado galleries in the past 6 months. We've been tracking her, but she's good at staying just ahead of investigations. Marcus, I think she's working with my husband." The silence on the other end of the line stretched uncomfortably long. Finally, Marcus spoke, his tone careful and professional. "Sarah, if your husband is involved with Victoria Cross, you need to be very careful. Art fraud is a federal crime, and anyone associated with it can face serious charges, even if they believe they're acting legitimately." After hanging up, Sarah sat staring at her phone. Art fraud. Federal crime. The words kept echoing in her mind as she tried to process the implications. Brett wasn't just making bad business decisions. If Marcus was right, he was potentially committing crimes that could destroy their family's future. Her hands shook as she called Jake. "I need your help," she said without preamble, "and I need it today." 2 hours later, Jake Thompson sat across from Sarah at a coffee shop near the museum, his laptop open and his expression grim as she recounted her conversation with Marcus. "This is worse than I thought," Jake said, making notes on a legal pad. "Art fraud investigations can drag on for years, even if Brett believes he's acting legitimately. If he's selling fake pieces, he's liable. But what if he doesn't know? What if Victoria is manipulating him?" Jake looked up from his notes. "Sarah, you're 6 months pregnant. Your husband has drained your savings account. Whether he's a victim or a co-conspirator doesn't change the fact that you and your baby could be left with nothing if this goes bad. So what do? We gather evidence. If Brett is being conned, we expose Victoria and protect him. If he's actively participating in fraud, we make sure you are not held liable." Jake pulled up a legal document on his laptop. "This is a spousal protection filing. It essentially creates a legal barrier between your assets and any potential criminal liability Brett might face. It's not foolproof, but it's a start." Sarah stared at the document, feeling a mix of betrayal and necessity. 6 months ago, she had been planning nursery colors and choosing baby names. Now she was discussing spousal protection orders and federal fraud investigations. "There's something else," Jake continued. "I ran Victoria Cross through some legal databases. She's got a sealed juvenile record in New York, and there are at least 3 civil suits filed against her in California for breach of contract related to art sales. Can we access those records? The juvenile stuff is locked down, but the civil cases might give us insight into her methods." Jake's expression softened. "Sarah, I know this is overwhelming, especially with everything else you're dealing with right now, but we need to move fast. If this exhibition happens and people lose money on fake art, the investigation will expand to include everyone involved." Sarah felt the baby kick, a now familiar reminder that she wasn't making decisions just for herself anymore. Every choice she made would impact the life growing inside her. "Do it," she said finally. "File the protection order. Get the civil case information. I need to know exactly what I'm dealing with." As they left the coffee shop, Jake placed a protective hand on her shoulder. "We'll figure this out, Sarah, but you need to be prepared for the possibility that Brett might be more involved than you want to believe." The afternoon sunlight felt too bright, too normal for the weight of the conversation. Sarah walked slowly to her car, feeling the burden of knowledge settling onto her shoulders. Tonight, she would have to go home and sit across the dinner table from a man who might be either a fool or a criminal. Either way, her life as she knew it was over. Sarah spent the afternoon creating a timeline, using her museum training and archival research. She mapped out every mention of Victoria Cross she could find, cross-referencing dates with Brett's recent behavior changes and their financial records. The pattern was damning. Victoria had first contacted Brett's gallery exactly 7 months ago. Within 2 weeks, Brett's demeanor had shifted from his usual confident ambition to something more manic and secretive. The large withdrawals had started a month later, always justified as gallery investments or exhibition costs. Most telling was the timing of Victoria's previous ventures. In each city where she had operated, she had followed the same pattern: identify a gallery owner with social connections and family money, develop a personal relationship, propose an exclusive exhibition that required significant upfront investment, then disappear when authentication questions arose. Brett wasn't her first victim. He was just her latest. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Brett. "Working late again tonight. Victoria needs help with catalog preparation. Don't wait up." Victoria needs help. The phrase that had become Brett's standard excuse for late nights, missed dinners, and increasing distance from his pregnant wife. Sarah made a decision that surprised her with its clarity. She was going to the gallery tonight. At 8:30, Sarah parked across the street from Harrison Gallery, the converted warehouse space that had been Brett's pride and joy since inheriting it from his father. Through the large windows, she could see figures moving around inside, silhouetted against bright work lights. She recognized Brett's profile immediately. The other figure was smaller, more graceful, with long dark hair that caught the light as she moved. Victoria Cross, finally revealed. Sarah watched as Victoria gestured animatedly at a large canvas, her body language intimate and commanding. Brett hung on her every word, leaning close as she spoke, his attention completely captured. But it was the artwork itself that made Sarah's blood run cold. Even from across the street, even through gallery windows, she could see enough detail to recognize the piece Victoria was presenting to Brett. The composition, the color palette, the brushwork style. Sarah had seen this exact piece before, 18 months ago, when it had sold at Sotheby's for $2.3 million. The original was hanging in a private collection in Switzerland. Sarah fumbled for her phone, using the camera's zoom function to get a closer look. The piece was unmistakably a reproduction, but masterfully done. Without expert analysis, most people would never question its authenticity. As she watched, Victoria pulled out what appeared to be documentation, spreading papers across a table for Brett to examine. Provenance papers, authentication certificates, exhibition history, all of it elaborately falsified. Brett was studying the documents with the focused attention of someone who wanted desperately to believe what he was seeing. Victoria stood behind him, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder in a gesture that was simultaneously professional and intimate. Sarah's phone rang, startling her. Jake's name appeared on the screen. "I got the information from those California civil suits," Jake said without preamble. "Sarah, Victoria Cross isn't just running art fraud. She's running romance fraud alongside it. In every case, she'd developed personal relationships with her marks. 2 of the victims were married men with pregnant wives." Through the gallery windows, Sarah watched Victoria lean closer to Brett, pointing at something on the documentation. Brett nodded enthusiastically, then reached into his jacket and pulled out what looked like a checkbook. "Jake," Sarah whispered, "I think I'm watching it happen right now." She described what she was seeing, her voice tight with disbelief and anger. Jake listened quietly, then spoke with the calm precision of someone delivering bad news. "Sarah, you need to leave, right now. If they discover you watching them, Victoria will accelerate whatever timeline she's working on. We need more evidence before we confront this directly." But Sarah couldn't move. She watched Brett write what appeared to be another substantial check, watched Victoria accept it with a smile that never reached her eyes. The woman was a consummate performer, playing the role of passionate artist while systematically dismantling Sarah's family's financial future. As Victoria tucked the check into her purse, she glanced toward the window. For a moment, her eyes seemed to meet Sarah's across the dark street. Victoria's expression didn't change, but something in her posture sharpened, like a predator recognizing prey. Sarah's hands trembled as she started her car. Victoria Cross knew she was being watched. The game, whatever it was, had just changed. Driving home through Denver's quiet residential streets, Sarah felt the baby moving restlessly inside her. The life growing within her seemed to sense the danger surrounding their family, responding to Sarah's elevated stress with increased activity. "It's okay, little one," Sarah whispered, one hand on her belly as she navigated the familiar turns toward home. "Mommy's going to fix this." But as she pulled into her driveway, Sarah realized she had no idea how to fix something this complex, this dangerous. Brett was being systematically deceived and manipulated by a professional con artist. Their savings were disappearing into forged artwork and false promises. And now Victoria Cross knew that someone was watching her operation. The perfect storm was gathering, and Sarah was standing directly in its path. Sarah didn't sleep that night. She lay in bed listening to every sound, every creak of the house settling, every car that passed on their quiet street. Brett came home after midnight, moving carefully through the darkened house, trying not to wake her. She pretended to be asleep when he slipped into bed beside her, but his restless energy was palpable. He tossed and turned for what felt like hours, muttering occasionally in his sleep. Once, she heard him say Victoria's name, his voice carrying a mix of anxiety and something else that sounded uncomfortably like longing. By morning, Sarah had made her decision. She was going to confront Brett directly. She found him in the kitchen at 6 a.m., already dressed and checking his phone obsessively. His coffee sat untouched beside him, and the shadows under his eyes suggested he had slept as poorly as she had. "We need to talk," Sarah said, settling into the chair across from him. Brett looked up, and for a moment she saw panic flash across his features. "About what?" "About Victoria Cross, about our missing savings, about what's really happening at the gallery." The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Brett's hand tightened around his phone, and Sarah could see him calculating responses, weighing how much truth he could afford to reveal. Sarah, you're pregnant and stressed. You don't need to worry about gallery business right now. Don't." Sarah's voice carried a sharpness that surprised them both. "Don't treat me like I'm fragile or stupid. I built a career to spotting art fraud. Brett, I know what forgery looks like, and I know what desperation looks like. Right now, I'm seeing both." Brett's face went white. "What are you talking about?" Sarah pulled out her phone, showing him the photos she had taken through the gallery windows. The artwork, the documentation, Victoria's intimate body language as she guided him through what was obviously a carefully orchestrated deception. "I know about the civil suits in California. I know about the questionable Rothko she tried to sell in Denver. I know that she's a professional con artist who targets gallery owners with family money and pregnant wives." Brett stared at the photos, his expression cycling through denial, anger, and finally something that looked like relief mixed with terror. "You don't understand," he said finally. "The opportunities she's bringing us, the connections, the potential for international recognition. Brett, the piece she showed you last night sold at Sotheby's 18 months ago. It's hanging in a private collection in Switzerland. What she's showing you is a reproduction." "That's impossible." But his voice lacked conviction. "Victoria has authentication documents, provenance papers." "Forged." Sarah leaned forward, fighting to keep her voice calm and professional. "Every piece of documentation can be falsified. You know this. Brett, your father taught you to verify everything independently." Brett's phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at it, and Sarah saw his jaw tighten. "She wants to meet this morning. Says it's urgent, about the authentication process." "Don't go." "I have to. Sarah, we've already invested too much to walk away now. If there's even a chance that you're wrong, then we verify independently. We bring in Marcus Hoffman from the museum. We run proper authentication tests. We check every piece of documentation through official channels." Brett shook his head. "There's no time. The exhibition opens in 2 weeks. We have collectors flying in from New York and Los Angeles." Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. "What collectors, Brett?" Who exactly is buying these pieces? Private collectors, people Victoria has worked with before. His voice trailed off as he realized the implications of what he was saying. People she's defrauded before. You mean? Brett's phone buzzed again. This time, Sarah could see the message over his shoulder. Brett, we need to talk immediately. There may be a problem with our timeline, but you are on V. She knows, Sarah said quietly. She saw me watching last night. She knows someone is investigating her. Brett stood abruptly, grabbing his jacket. I have to meet with her. I have to find out what's happening. Brett, don't. If you go to that meeting, you're walking into whatever trap she's setting. Call the police. Call the FBI Art Fraud Division. Call someone who can handle this professionally. But he was already moving toward the door. I can't just abandon everything we've worked for based on suspicions and internet searches. As the door closed behind him, Sarah felt the baby kick hard against her ribs, as if responding to her surge of adrenaline and fear. She reached for her phone, calling Jake with trembling fingers. He's going to meet with her, she said as soon as Jake answered. Brett's walking directly into whatever endgame Victoria is planning, and I don't think he's coming back from this the same person. The morning sunlight streaming through her kitchen windows felt deceptively peaceful, masking the storm that was about to break over their lives. In a few hours, Sarah knew everything would be different. The question was whether Brett would emerge as Victoria's victim or her accomplice. Either way, Sarah realized with crystalline clarity, her marriage as she had known it was over. Jake arrived within an hour, carrying a briefcase full of legal documents and wearing the grim expression of someone preparing for battle. Sarah met him at the door, her phone clutched in her hand like a lifeline. Any word from Brett? Jake asked, settling into the living room chair that had become his unofficial post during this crisis. Nothing. It's been 2 hours since he left to meet Victoria. Sarah paced restlessly, one hand pressed against her lower back where the baby's position was causing increasing discomfort. Jake, I keep thinking about what you said yesterday, about how we never really know the people closest to us. It was a truth that applied to so many relationships, Sarah realized. How many people had sat in living rooms just like this one, discovering that their partners were strangers? How many women had felt this particular combination of betrayal and fear, wondering if the person they had trusted with their future had been lying all along? We're going to get through this, Jake said, dumb, but his tone carried doubt. I've been in touch with the FBI Art Fraud Division. They're familiar with Victoria Cross, though they've been calling her Victoria Chen in their files. She's been using multiple identities as she moves from city to city. Sarah stopped pacing. Multiple identities. At least 3 that they've tracked. Victoria Cross, Victoria Chen, Victoria Clark. Always similar names, probably to avoid confusion when she's running multiple cons simultaneously. Jake opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. Sarah, I need to show you something. The FBI sent over her file, and there are details about her methods that you need to understand. He spread photographs across the coffee table. Different men, different cities, but the same pattern repeated over and over. Gallery owners, antique dealers, private collectors, all of them middle-aged, financially comfortable, and emotionally vulnerable for various reasons. Several had pregnant wives. She's not just running art fraud, Jake explained. She's running sophisticated psychological manipulation. She identifies men who are facing major life transitions, stress, or responsibility, and she offers them an escape fantasy wrapped in professional opportunity. Sarah picked up one of the photographs, studying the face of a man who looked remarkably similar to Brett. Same age, same confident bearing, same slight desperation around the eyes. What happened to him? Thomas Richardson, gallery owner in Portland. She convinced him to invest his daughter's college fund in what turned out to be forged pre-Columbian artifacts. He's currently serving 18 months in federal prison for knowingly selling fraudulent pieces. The baby shifted uncomfortably, responding to Sarah's stress. She placed both hands on her belly, feeling the solid reality of the life growing inside her. Whatever happened with Brett, whatever choices he made, she had to protect this child. Jake, I need to know the truth. Is Brett a victim or a co-conspirator? Before Jake could answer, Sarah's phone rang. Brett's name flashed on the screen, and she answered immediately. Sarah, Brett's voice sounded strange, hollow. I need you to come to the gallery, right now. Brett, what's happening? Are you okay? Just come, please. And Sarah, bring your museum authentication contacts. All of them. The line went dead. Jake was already standing, gathering the FBI documents. That sounded like a setup, or like someone who just realized he's been played. They drove to the gallery in tense silence, Jake's car following Sarah's through downtown Denver traffic. The late morning sun cast long shadows between the buildings, and Sarah found herself noticing details with unusual clarity, the way pedestrians moved purposefully down sidewalks, the casual normalcy of people going about their daily lives while her world collapsed around her. The gallery parking lot was nearly empty except for Brett's car and an unfamiliar black sedan with California plates. Through the large windows, Sarah could see figures moving inside, but the angle made it impossible to identify who was present. Stay behind me, Jake instructed as they approached the entrance. If this goes wrong, get back to the car and call the police. The gallery door was unlocked. As they stepped inside, Sarah immediately noticed the changes. Several pieces she had seen during previous visits were gone, replaced by artwork she didn't recognize. The lighting had been adjusted to create dramatic shadows, and the usual organized displays looked hastily rearranged. Brett stood near the back of the gallery, his face pale and his hands shaking slightly. Beside him stood Victoria Cross, even more striking in person than she had appeared through the gallery windows. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe style that emphasized her sharp cheekbones and calculating eyes. But it was the third person present who made Sarah's blood run cold. A tall man in an expensive suit stood examining one of the paintings with the focused attention of an expert. Sarah recognized him immediately from her museum work. FBI Special Agent David Morrison, head of the Denver office's art fraud division. Mrs. Mitchell, Agent Morrison said, looking up from the painting, I'm glad you're here. We need to talk. Victoria Cross smiled, but the expression held no warmth. Hello, Sarah. I've been looking forward to meeting you. Brett has told me so much about his talented wife. The words were pleasant enough, but something in Victoria's tone made it clear that this was not a social introduction. This was a confrontation that had been carefully orchestrated, and Sarah had just walked into the center of it. The baby kicked hard against Sarah's ribs, as if sensing the danger surrounding them. Whatever was about to happen, Sarah realized, would determine not just her family's future, but potentially their freedom as well. Agent Morrison gestured toward the seating area that had been arranged near the gallery's main display wall. Sarah noticed that someone had positioned the chairs to face several paintings, creating an impromptu presentation space. Mrs. Mitchell, your husband contacted our office this morning with some concerning information about potential fraud involving these artworks. Agent Morrison began. Before we proceed, I want you to understand that anything said here will be part of an official investigation. Sarah looked at Brett, searching his face for clues about what had transpired during his meeting with Victoria. His expression was unreadable, caught somewhere between relief and terror. Victoria maintained her composed smile, but Sarah noticed tension in her shoulders, a slight tightness around her eyes. Whatever game she had been playing, it wasn't proceeding according to her plan. Brett came to me this morning with authentication concerns, Victoria said, her voice carrying just the right note of professional disappointment. Apparently, his wife has been conducting some sort of amateur investigation that has raised unnecessary doubts about perfectly legitimate artwork. Legitimate? Sarah couldn't keep the disbelief from her voice. That piece you showed Brett last night is a reproduction of a work that sold at Sotheby's 18 months ago. Agent Morrison pulled out a tablet, swiping to display high-resolution photographs. Actually, Mrs. Mitchell, that's where this situation becomes interesting. The piece in question is indeed a reproduction, but according to Mrs. Cross, it was always intended to be sold as such. Sarah felt the floor shift beneath her feet. What? Victoria stepped forward, her expression now radiating wounded professionalism. Mr. Mitchell approached me 6 months ago about creating high-quality reproductions for clients who wanted famous pieces but couldn't afford originals. Everything we've done has been completely legal and properly documented. She gestured toward a stack of paperwork on a nearby table. Every piece has been clearly marked as a reproduction in all documentation. Every sale has been conducted with full disclosure to buyers. If Mr. Mitchell has been misrepresenting these pieces as originals, that's not my responsibility. The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. If Victoria's story was true, if she had documentation proving the pieces were always intended as reproductions, then Brett was the one who had committed fraud by misrepresenting them to potential buyers. That's not possible, Sarah said. But even as she spoke, she could see Agent Morrison's expression, becoming more skeptical of her version of events. Brett finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah, I never told you the whole truth about the business model. The reproduction market is huge and completely legal as long as everything is properly disclosed. But the $50,000, the secret meetings, the locked filing cabinets. I locked those fees because I knew you would worry about the financial risk. Brett said, the $50,000 was investment capital for inventory and marketing. I was trying to protect you from stress during your pregnancy. Victoria nodded sympathetically. I've worked with several married clients who preferred to keep their wives out of business decisions during pregnancy. It's actually quite common. Sarah looked around the room, feeling reality shifting around her. Either Victoria was an extraordinarily skilled manipulator who had anticipated this exact scenario, or Sarah had fundamentally misunderstood what was happening with Brett Norworth's business. Jake stepped forward, pulling out the FBI file folder. Agent Morrison, I think you need to see this information about Victoria Cross's history in other states. But Victoria was ready for this as well. You mean Victoria Chen and Victoria Clark? Yes, those are my former professional names. I changed my name legally after some unfortunate experiences with clients who became obsessive and began stalking me. I've been completely transparent with law enforcement about my identity changes. Agent Morrison reviewed Jake's documents, his expression increasingly neutral. Mr. Thompson, the information you've provided shows civil disputes and business disagreements, but nothing that constitutes criminal fraud. If Mrs. Cross has been operating legitimate reproduction businesses in multiple states, name changes for personal safety reasons are not unusual. Sarah felt the baby kick frantically, responding to her elevated heart rate and stress. The room seemed to be spinning slightly, and she realized she needed to sit down. Mrs. Mitchell, are you all right? Victoria's voice carried perfectly calibrated concern. Perhaps this stress isn't good for the baby. As Sarah sank into a chair, she caught a glimpse of Victoria's expression when the other woman thought no one was looking. For just a moment, the mask slipped, revealing something cold and calculating underneath the professional concern. But the moment passed so quickly that Sarah couldn't be certain she had seen it at all. And looking around the room, she realized that everyone else was accepting Victoria's version of events as the most plausible explanation. Either Sarah was losing her mind, or she was watching a master manipulator execute the perfect con in real time. The terrifying part was that she was no longer certain which scenario was true. Agent Morrison closed his tablet and stood, his body language suggesting the investigation was essentially over. Mrs. Mitchell, I understand your concerns, but based on the documentation Mrs. Cross has provided, this appears to be a legitimate business dispute rather than criminal fraud. Sarah gripped the arms of her chair, fighting against waves of dizziness and confusion. Oh, Agent Morrison, can you just verify the authentication of one-piece run independent analysis on the provenance documents? Mrs. Mitchell, Victoria interjected gently. That would be expensive and time-consuming for everyone involved. And frankly, it might be seen as harassment of a legitimate businesswoman who has already been subjected to unfounded accusations. The words were perfectly chosen. Sarah realized Victoria was positioning herself as the victim of an unstable pregnant woman's paranoid delusions. Every response had been calculated to make Sarah appear irrational, while Victoria emerged as the professional, reasonable party. Brett stepped closer to Sarah's chair, his hand resting on her shoulder in what might have been meant as comfort but felt more like restraint. Honey, maybe we should go home. You're clearly stressed, and this isn't good for the baby. I'm not stressed because I'm pregnant, Sarah said sharply. I'm stressed because something about this entire situation doesn't make sense. But even as she spoke, Sarah could see that everyone in the room had already reached their conclusions. Agent Morrison was packing up his materials. Jake looked confused and slightly embarrassed. Brett seemed relieved that the immediate crisis had passed. Only Victoria maintained the perfect expression of concerned professionalism. But Sarah caught another glimpse of something else underneath. Satisfaction. The look of someone whose plan had worked exactly as intended. Mrs. Mitchell, Agent Morrison said, handing her a business card. If you discover any concrete evidence of criminal activity, please contact our office immediately. But I'd recommend focusing on your health and your pregnancy right now. As the agent left, Victoria began gathering her own materials. Brett, I think it might be best if we postpone the exhibition for a few weeks. Give everyone time to settle down and refocus. But the collectors, the advanced publicity, can all be rescheduled. Your family needs to come first. Victoria's smile was perfectly calibrated to convey understanding and flexibility. I'll handle all the communications with potential buyers. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. If Victoria controlled communication with buyers, she could manipulate the entire narrative around the exhibition postponement. She could position Brett as unreliable while maintaining her own reputation as the accommodating professional. How convenient, Sarah muttered. Victoria's smile never wavered, but her eyes sharpened. I'm sorry, did you say something? Before Sarah could respond, Brett intervened. Victoria, thank you for being so understanding about all of this. Sarah's been under a lot of stress with the pregnancy, and I think her judgment has been affected. The casual dismissal of her concerns as pregnancy-related irrationality was the final straw. Sarah stood up abruptly, ignoring the dizziness that threatened to overwhelm her. My judgment is fine. Brett, what's affected is my ability to pretend that everything is normal when it clearly isn't. She looked directly at Victoria. I don't know exactly how you're doing this, but I know you're running some kind of con, and I know that in 3 months, when the baby is born and I'm not dealing with the pregnancy complications, I'm going to figure out exactly what you're taking from us. Victoria's expression remained perfectly sympathetic, but something in her posture shifted almost imperceptibly. Sarah, I hope you feel better soon. Pregnancy can be such a difficult time for women, emotionally as well as physically. As they walked to their cars, Jake pulled Sarah aside. I don't understand what just happened in there. Either Victoria Cross is completely legitimate, or she's the most sophisticated con artist I've ever encountered. She's playing a long game, Sarah said quietly. Everything that just happened was planned. She wanted me to look paranoid and unstable. She wanted Brett to choose between believing his pregnant wife or trusting the professional businesswoman who's offering him success. And he chose her. Sarah looked back at the gallery, where Brett and Victoria stood in animated conversation near the front windows. Even from a distance, their body language suggested intimacy that went beyond professional collaboration. Yeah, Sarah said, feeling something fundamental shift inside her. He chose her. Driving home alone, Sarah realized that the investigation had revealed more than she had bargained for. She now knew that Victoria Cross was either completely legitimate or dangerously skilled at creating legal cover for criminal activity. But more importantly, she knew that Brett was willing to dismiss her concerns and prioritize his business relationship with Victoria over his marriage. The baby kicked insistently, and Sarah placed her hand over the movement. Whatever game Victoria was playing, whatever Brett's role in it might be, Sarah had to start thinking about protecting herself and her child. The perfect setup was complete. Now she had to figure out how to survive what came next. 3 days passed in tense normalcy. Brett came home at regular hours, ate dinner with Sarah, and made careful conversation about safe topics like baby names and nursery preparations. But the careful politeness between them felt more like a ceasefire than a reconciliation. Sarah found herself studying her husband during these quiet moments, searching for signs of the man she had married beneath the stranger he had become. Sometimes she caught glimpses of him in unguarded moments, the way he still automatically reached for her hand when they walked together, or how his face softened when he felt the baby kick against her belly. But there were other moments too, times when his phone buzzed and his entire body tensed, when he would glance toward the door as if calculating escape routes, when she would catch him staring at nothing with an expression of barely controlled panic. Whatever Victoria Cross had done to him, whatever web she had woven around their lives, it was still tightening its grip even after the FBI meeting. On Thursday morning, Sarah's phone rang with a call that changed everything. Mrs. Mitchell, this is Detective Williams with Denver PD Financial Crimes Division. We need you to come in immediately. There's been a development in the Victoria Cross investigation. Sarah's heart raced. What kind of development? Ma'am, I prefer to discuss this in person. Can you be here within the hour? The tone in Detective Williams' voice carried an urgency that made Sarah's hands shake as she gathered her purse and keys. She left a note for Brett, who had already departed for the gallery, saying only that she had a doctor's appointment. The police station was a maze of gray corridors and fluorescent lighting that made everyone look exhausted. Detective Williams was a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and the bearing of someone who had seen enough human deception to be skeptical of everything. Mrs. Mitchell, yesterday evening we received a call from FBI agent Morrison. Apparently, Mrs. Cross contacted him with some disturbing information about your husband. Sarah felt the familiar chill of impending disaster. What information? Detective Williams opened a file folder, revealing bank statements and financial documents Sarah had never seen before. According to Mrs. Cross, your husband has been using the reproduction business as a front for money laundering. She claims he approached her specifically because he needed a way to move large amounts of cash through seemingly legitimate art sales. The words didn't make sense. Sarah stared at the documents, trying to process what she was seeing. Numbers that were far larger than anything she had imagined. Transactions dating back months before she had even heard Victoria's name. That's impossible. Mrs. Mitchell, we've traced several large cash deposits to your husband's business accounts that don't correspond to any documented sales. Money that appears to have come from sources your husband has been reluctant to explain. Detective Williams spread out more documents. Bank transfers, cash deposits, wire transfers from offshore accounts. The amounts were staggering, far more than the $50,000 Sarah had initially discovered. Where is this money coming from? That's what we're trying to determine. Mrs. Cross has provided us with documentation suggesting that your husband contacted her 6 months ago with a specific request to create a business relationship that would allow him to process large cash transactions. Sarah felt the baby shift restlessly inside her, responding to her elevated stress and heart rate. She placed both hands on her belly, trying to steady herself as the room seemed to tilt slightly. Detective Williams, I need you to understand something. 3 days ago, I believe Victoria Cross was running a con on my husband. Now you're telling me she's provided evidence that my husband is the criminal. Mrs. Mitchell, this is why we called you in. Mrs. Cross claims that you discovered some of these financial irregularities and have been trying to expose them. She says you contacted the FBI because you were concerned about your husband's activities. The room seemed to tilt slightly. Victoria hadn't just anticipated Sarah's investigation. She had used it as evidence of Brett's guilt, positioning Sarah as the concerned wife who had uncovered her husband's criminal activities. Sarah felt a moment of vertigo that had nothing to do with her pregnancy. The manipulation was so sophisticated, so perfectly orchestrated, that it took her breath away. Victoria had turned Sarah's legitimate concerns into evidence of Brett's guilt, while simultaneously positioning herself as the cooperative witness helping law enforcement. She's playing us against each other, Sarah said quietly. Both of us. Detective Williams leaned forward, her expression skeptical but attentive. What do you mean? I think Victoria Cross has been setting this up from the beginning. She approached Brett with what looked like a legitimate business opportunity, got him to invest money and make financial moves that would look suspicious to investigators, then used my concerns about her as evidence that something criminal was happening. Sarah's mind was racing now, putting together pieces she hadn't seen before. Detective, when exactly did these large deposits start, and who initiated each transaction? Mrs. Mitchell, that would require an extraordinary level of planning and manipulation. Yes, it would. Sarah placed her hands on her belly, feeling the baby's movements as a reminder of what she was fighting for. Detective, I need you to look at one more thing. Can you trace exactly when these large deposits started in relation to when Victoria Cross first contacted my husband? Detective Williams pulled out a laptop, her fingers moving quickly across the keyboard. I can cross-reference the timelines we have on file. As they waited for the data to load, Sarah felt a strange sense of clarity settling over her. The fear and confusion of the past weeks were crystallizing into something sharper, more focused. If Victoria Cross was as sophisticated as Sarah suspected, then there would be patterns hidden in the chaos, breadcrumbs that would reveal the true scope of her manipulation. Here's what I'm seeing, Detective Williams said, turning the laptop screen towards Sarah. The first significant deposit was made 2 days after Ms. Cross's initial contact with your husband's gallery. Every subsequent large transaction corresponds to documented meetings or communications between them. Sarah studied the timeline, feeling pieces click into place with an almost audible snap. She needed someone to take the fall for whatever money laundering operation she's really running. Brett was perfect, financially comfortable, socially connected, and about to become a father, which would make him seem desperate enough to take risks. An hour later, Detective Williams had created a new timeline that told a different story. The suspicious financial activity had begun within 2 weeks of Victoria's first contact with Brett. Every questionable transaction corresponded to a documented interaction with Victoria or her associates. But more importantly, they had discovered something else. The offshore accounts that had been sending money to Brett's gallery were also connected to similar operations in 3 other states, all involving galleries or art dealers who had been working with women using variations of Victoria's name. Mrs. Mitchell, if your theory is correct, then Victoria Cross has orchestrated an elaborate frame-up of your husband while simultaneously positioning herself as the helpful businesswoman who tried to work with law enforcement to expose his crimes. Sarah felt the baby kick hard against her ribs, as if responding to her surge of adrenaline. She's done this before, hasn't she? This exact same setup. Detective Williams nodded grimly. We're coordinating with law enforcement in California, Oregon, and Arizona. The pattern is consistent across all 4 states. What happens now? We're going to need your full cooperation in building a case against Mrs. Cross and Mrs. Mitchell. You should know that this investigation is going to get complicated very quickly. We'll need to set up surveillance, record conversations, possibly use you and your husband as witnesses in a federal sting operation. As Sarah left the police station, she realized that Victoria's most sophisticated manipulation hadn't been the art fraud or even the financial scheme. It had been turning Sarah and Brett against each other, destroying their ability to trust each other just when they needed to work together most. The baby kicked hard, and Sarah whispered, "It's okay, little one. Mommy's going to fix this mess." But first, she had to go home and tell Brett that they had both been played and a criminal who was more dangerous than either of them had imagined. And then, together, they would have to find the courage to help bring her down. Brett's face went white as Sarah explained everything Detective Williams had revealed. They sat across from each other at their kitchen table, the same table where Sarah had first confronted him about the missing $50,000. But now the dynamic between them had shifted completely. "She used us," Brett said quietly. "Both of us. The question is what we do about it now." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was the silence of 2 people who had finally stopped fighting each other and were ready to fight together against a common enemy. Over the next 2 weeks, Sarah and Brett worked with Detective Williams and Agent Morrison to build a comprehensive case against Victoria Cross. The investigation revealed the full scope of her operation. She had been running sophisticated money laundering schemes in 4 states, using legitimate business people as unwitting fronts for moving criminal proceeds through the art market. Brett's gallery had been just one node in a network of businesses Victoria had compromised. The offshore accounts, the suspicious cash transactions, the forged documentation, all of it had been designed to create the appearance of money laundering while actually facilitating it through other channels. "She's brilliant," Agent Morrison admitted during one of their meetings. She identified people who were financially comfortable but not wealthy enough to hire independent verification for every transaction. People who were facing major life changes that made them vulnerable to promises of financial success. The baby chose that moment to kick hard against Sarah's ribs, and she winced. At 8 months pregnant, every movement was a reminder that time was running out to resolve this crisis before their child arrived. Sarah reached for Brett's hand across the conference table, and for the first time in months, his response was immediate and genuine. The investigation had stripped away all the pretense between them, leaving only the raw truth of their partnership. "What happens to us now?" Sarah asked. "Mrs. Cross will face federal charges for money laundering, art fraud, and wire fraud across multiple states. You and your husband will need to testify, but as victims rather than defendants." Jake, who had become their unofficial legal advocate throughout the process, leaned forward. "What about the financial losses? Asset forfeiture will recover some of the stolen money, but it's unlikely you'll get back everything you lost. Brett squeezed Sarah's hand. We can rebuild, he said. We know how to do this the right way now. The weeks that followed were a blur of depositions, evidence review, and preparation for trial. Sarah found herself relying on skills she had developed as a museum curator, organizing complex information and presenting it clearly to people who needed to understand the full scope of Victoria's deception. But more importantly, she and Brett were learning to work as a team again. Late nights reviewing financial documents became opportunities to talk through everything that had gone wrong in their marriage, everything they had hidden from each other out of misguided protectiveness. I thought I was shielding you from stress, Brett admitted one evening as they sorted through bank statements. But really, I was shielding myself from having to admit I didn't know what I was doing. And I thought I was being supportive by not questioning your decisions, Sarah replied. But really, I was avoiding conflict because I was afraid of losing you. 2 months later, Sarah held their newborn daughter in her arms as she watched news coverage of Victoria Cross's arrest. The woman who had nearly destroyed their family looked smaller somehow, diminished by orange prison clothing and handcuffs. Brett sat beside her on the hospital bed, his finger gently stroking their baby's tiny hand. I'm sorry, Pa, he said for perhaps the 100th time since the truth had been revealed. I should have listened to you from the beginning. We both made mistakes, Sarah replied, studying their daughter's perfect features. But we figured it out in time. The gallery had survived, rebuilt on a foundation of transparency and careful authentication procedures. Sarah had already begun planning her return to work part-time at the museum, using her experience with the Victoria Cross case to help develop new protocols for identifying sophisticated art fraud. Most importantly, they had learned to trust each other again. The crisis had revealed weaknesses in their marriage, but also strengths they hadn't known they possessed. Jake visited regularly, bearing gifts for the baby and updates on Victoria's prosecution. The case had become a model for how to investigate complex financial fraud schemes that crossed state lines and involved multiple victims. She's already made a plea deal, Ceremony, Jake reported during one visit. 15 years federal prison, full restitution to victims, and cooperation with ongoing investigations into the money laundering network she was part of. Sarah looked down at her sleeping daughter, thinking about the future they were building together. The baby would grow up hearing this story, learning about the importance of trusting your instincts, asking hard questions, and standing up to deception even when it was dressed up as opportunity. You know what's interesting, Sarah said to Brett one evening as they sat in their living room, the baby sleeping peacefully in her crib nearby. Victoria was right about one thing. We did make a great team when we finally started working together. Brett smiled, the first genuine smile she had seen from him in months. Maybe that's the real lesson in all of this, that the best defense against people who try to manipulate us is to stick together and trust each other. The months following Victoria's sentencing brought unexpected healing. Sarah discovered that testifying at the trial had given her a sense of closure she hadn't anticipated. Standing in that courtroom, telling their story to a jury, had transformed her from victim to survivor to advocate. Brett threw himself into rebuilding the gallery's reputation, implementing verification procedures that exceeded industry standards. He began speaking at art dealer conferences about recognizing and preventing fraud, turning their painful experience into something that could protect others. 6 months after Victoria's sentencing, Sarah received a letter in prison mail. Victoria had written to her, a brief note that said simply, "You were smarter than I expected. I respect that." Sarah showed the letter to Brett, then threw it away without responding. Some conversations weren't worth having, and some people didn't deserve the satisfaction of knowing they were still in your thoughts. Instead, Sarah focused on the future they were building, a thriving gallery based on honest dealing, a growing family, and the hard-won knowledge that the best partnerships are built on truth, trust, and the willingness to fight together against whatever challenges come their way. The baby laughed from her high chair, reaching for the colorful mobile hanging above her. In that sound, Sarah heard everything she had fought to protect: innocence, joy, and the promise of a future built on solid ground rather than beautiful lies. Their story had ended not with revenge or dramatic confrontation, but with justice served and a family stronger for having survived the storm together. Sometimes, Sarah reflected, The most powerful victory is simply refusing to let someone else's deception destroy what you've built. As evening settled over their home, Sarah watched Brett reading a bedtime story to their daughter, his voice gentle and sure. The man who had once been willing to risk everything for a stranger's promises had learned to treasure what was real, what was honest, what was worth protecting. And in that transformation, Sarah found not just forgiveness, but hope for all the years ahead.